I'm sure the first thing you think of when you hear toll booth is the immense annoyance of your travel being interrupted just to be charged a few bucks to pass through. The mental image most of you might conjure is a clogged up interstate with lines of automobiles crowded together, waiting to pay and move on. I can assume the people who work at such booths find it even more boring than you do. But the one I work at couldn't be further from the cliché. The toll booth I operate is situated on a quiet country road that curves a few times along its course through the dense forests surrounding it, far away from any major roadway. The booth itself is more like a little wooden shack with chipped paint and an antique sign that reads 25 cents, a sum I don't believe has changed since sometime in the 1950s. I believe that's when they decided to cease pretending it was a normal toll booth. Its only accessory is the barrier arm I can flip up or down. The interior is minimal, with a solitary chair and a light on the ceiling. The only light besides the moon for kilometers. It only has one operator on any given night. Most nights, that's me. On the surface, it doesn't make sense why our local government would pay someone to sit out in the middle of nowhere to operate a booth that produces no money. And believe me, they pay well. But if you spent a single night out there, you would understand why. No, there isn't a sudden rush of 1,000 cars waiting to pay their tolls at 3 a.m. What we safeguard by keeping this booth functioning is worth far more than any monetary cost could make up for. In my town, the position of operating the lonely booth is one that is highly revered and rarely spoken of. In fact, it's kind of an unofficial rule that you keep secret any conversations concerning the booth, the route, or anything connected. Everyone around here knows there's something strange about this location. Almost everyone has seen something they can't explain, or something they wish they hadn't. A number of rural places have their own urban legends. Most of the time, their residents embrace the misconceptions. I suppose it's because everyone know it's a myth, save for a few crazies. Our town is the reverse. We stay quiet about the things we've seen. The most we can do around here is to steer folks away of the road and pray nobody strays from it. The last thing we want is for the rest of the world to find out. And I assume we're not the only ones. You see, our town is doing far better than most in our area. Our infrastructure never seems to disintegrate or degrade. Our public schools are well funded, and no one is ever trapped hunting for work. The reason this is remarkable is because our town isn't exactly in the most prosperous part of America. This money is coming from someplace, and it's not from our modest property taxes. I've got a sense that the feds, or someone else, is putting money into our town, and that they're keeping tabs on our little toll booth scenario as well. I realize this all sounds crazy now, but after you get a better picture of my position and of recent events, I hope you'll understand. As I noted, the booth only has one operator each night, a custom that extends as long back as we've been a town. Each week, we hold a private meeting at our town hall. At this conference are all current toll booth attendants and any past ones who can make it. Most of the time, the meetings don't take longer than 15 minutes. But after the emergency meeting I called a few weeks ago, we've held them every day, and they've been taking a lot longer. The reason for which you will know soon enough. I think now is a good moment to describe what happens at the toll booth and the road it sits on. You'll need to know my rules. Rule 1. The booth does not need to be staffed during the day. Not much happens at the booth when the sun is up, but the attendant for the night, who is generally me, must arrive at the booth an hour before nightfall and stay an hour after daybreak. The attendant for the night is not to leave the booth at any moment throughout their shift, for whatever reason. Transportation isn't an issue because either the sheriff or one of the officers always gives us a lift to the booth at night and a transport back to town in the morning. Rule 2. No mobile phone, radio, or other electronic communication device is allowed when operating the booth at night. The only thing running on electricity that a booth attendant is authorized to have is a flashlight. If you happen to bring a device and it accidentally turns on, store it inside the booth and pray that it doesn't turn itself back on. Leaving it outside the booth is not an option. Should your device turn itself on within the booth, your next best hope is to destroy it. This sounds like a severe measure, but I've made this mistake before. I lasted about an hour before I couldn't bear the cries coming from my phone and stomped it into oblivion. I haven't made the mistake of taking it with me again. I've never been told what the cries and other noises are, but I do know that former attendants have heard the same thing. Rule 3. Rare as they are, cars may approach the gate at any time during the night. A prevalent trait among folks who end up on this route at night is disorientation. The attendant's role is to decide whether they will be let through or turned away. The motorist, along with their uncertainty, may display other emotions: fear, despair, or even fury. They may be upset, furious, paranoid, or afraid. Try to calm them down and put their minds at ease as best you can. Once you believe they are ready, you will simply ask them to pay their toll. One of two outcomes will occur. If the driver makes no significant reaction, questions you, or delivers you a conventional quarter, you must leave the barrier arm down and turn them away. Do whatever is necessary to attempt to make them depart. If they threaten you or attempt to drive through anyhow, you can let them know you will be contacting the police, even if you have no means of calling them. This scenario is unlikely because no current navigation system would bring them down this path. All of the residents know not to use it, and it would be unusual for an outsider to learn about it. Though we have, on occasion, had to deal with a few misplaced travelers, most of the time they are complying. Get them off the road as soon as possible and steer them towards town, where they can get their footing. Above all else, they cannot enter through the gate. However, if you ask them to pay their toll, another consequence is possible, and unfortunately, it is the most common. They will come to a startling epiphany, as demonstrated by their facial expression. It's as if they remember something, slowly going into their pocket and drawing out a black penny. They know they will have to give it to you to pass. Some accept their fate sweetly, while others grieve, but they all follow the course. Once the barrier arm is lifted, they drive around the corner, never to be seen again. In my initial months working here, I was confused about who these people were. I pondered what it was they knew, how they acquired these coins in the first place, or what the coins even were. All I knew was to leave it in the booth to be picked up by the next shift. This was until I happened to be watching the local news one morning after I returned home. They talked about a man who was murdered in a car accident the night before and showed a picture of his face, a face I had seen only hours earlier. Puzzled and terrified, he had asked me where he was and what was going on. When I asked him for his toll, he hesitated, gently reached into his coat pocket with a shaking hand, and drew out a black coin before placing it in mine. He held the steering wheel and gazed forward, knowing he had to pass through and drive around the corner. He knew where he was heading. Sitting in my living room that morning, reliving the events of the last hours, I realized that I was the last person to see that man. He was already dead, just passing through, as were the thousands I had seen before and the countless more I knew I would see. It was the moment I knew the road was some type of passage to somewhere beyond. As for this rule, I don't believe anyone has ever stopped the dead from passing when their time has come. I don't think anyone ever could. It's something so bizarre that, in the moment, all you can do is let autopilot take over and proceed with your job as you were ordered. But as for letting the living through, I'm afraid it has been done before. A few decades back, a visitor from out of town was traveling through. Back then, he didn't have a phone to give him instructions, so he had to rely on a map. Even with a map, I'm convinced he didn't know of the route because it was never marked on any map. My best guess is that he happened to observe it and thought it could be some type of shortcut. When he approached the gate, he was, of course, turned away by the toll booth attendant. But he wasn't taking no for an answer. The man grew angry with the attendant, pushed him down, and raising the arm himself before driving through. This hadn't happened before, at least as far as any of the prior attendants of the booth who were still alive could recollect. No one was sure what would happen next. Back then, people just knew the rules, not the repercussions, but they didn't have to wait long to find out. The next night, the same man in the identical automobile rolled up to the booth. When asked for his toll, this time he presented a black coin. He seemed to have lost his memory of the night before, simply knowing that he needed to cross through, but not why. This has lasted every night for the previous few decades. Each night, he pulls up, bewildered as to why he's here and needs to pass, forgetting each time. Each night, he gives us a coin. Each time he passes on, driving around the bend into the woods, not seen until the next night. He never ages, and his appearance never changes. Sometimes he even says the same exact thing as the night before. Other times, he conveys a sense that he's been here before, and that everything feels familiar, like he almost remembers. His fate is one I wouldn't wish upon my greatest enemies. Dead, but not being permitted to move on, and never remembering why you're there. Living the same moment night after night, until who knows when. His story is one that reminds me of the importance of our job here, but he is not the only one. Rule 4. At some random point in the night, you may hear something moving through the trees, something enormous. Sometimes they emerge from the woods, other times they'll be coming down the road. Try not to be terrified. No harm is heading your way. Quite the reverse. However, I can understand how this would be hard to believe. In either scenario, you need to raise the arm and let them through. I recall the first time I saw them. I could hear a clop somewhere down the road, approaching towards the booth like a horse galloping. I climbed to my feet and grabbed my flashlight, fascinated. I remember hoping it wasn't someone's horse. I had never been advised what to do in that circumstance. When I did beam my flashlight toward the road, I nearly had a heart attack at the sight before me. A bull moose was approaching with a rapid pace. Of course, I had been warned about this, but the information I was provided were hazy. All I was informed was that a moose might approach the gate, and that I was required to allow it through. I wasn't warned that this animal stands at roughly 9 or 10 feet at the shoulder, or that its fur is so dark I couldn't see it without my flashlight, save for the gigantic antlers, which are white as snow in contrast. The only other portion of its body, plainly visible from afar, were its eyes, which shined with a small speck of white light burning in the darkness. I yelled and withdrew to my booth, tempted to go off into the night and abandon my station. Fortunately, the moose slowed its pace and eventually stopped in front of the barrier arm. This calmed me down, and I slowly raised it, watching as the moose approached to pass. As it did, I noticed the halter and reins on its head. I followed them up, only to encounter another set of eyes, identical to the moose's, towering over me. Again I yelled, but I reduced my volume when I noticed whoever or whatever this was on top of the moose was making eye contact with me as they passed. This figure was dark, if not darker than the moose it rode on, something close to a shadow. Just like everyone in their cars, they walked down the road beyond the bend and out of sight. I had to sit down for half an hour before I stopped shaking. Needless to say, I wasn't very delighted those finer details had been left out. Only after my shift and expressing my anger was I told more. Apparently, this hunter and his moose have been there a long time, so long that no attendant alive today can remember a time without them. Some believe they've been here for the past couple of 100 years or more, probably as long as the weird road and the booth have been present. What we do know is that they aren't tethered to the road like the others. At our town hall, we possess a documented description of the hunter and his mount, riding directly through town in the middle of the night back in 1919. To this day, a few residents have observed the moose while they're traveling at night. You may be wondering why I refer to the figure on the moose's back as the hunter. Well, that's what us attendants call him. Every so often, he and his moose will appear at the booth carrying a corpse behind them. When I say corpse, I don't mean an animal or even a human for that matter. I mean abominations out of your darkest nightmares. Things that send a shudder down your spine and make you want to puke at the same time. Things you would expect to find discussed in a religious literature when the end of days occurs. The hunter pulls these things down the road and around the curve. I can't be positive of anything, but if you ask me, he's taking them back to some type of afterlife or underworld. Maybe it's the same place the dead go when they drive around the curve, or maybe somewhere in the road is a pathway to many different locations. I couldn't tell you what I believe. Like the other attendants and everybody who knows about the hunter and his moose, I suppose they're here to protect us. Whatever these things are that he's bringing with him aren't supposed to be here in the first place, and he's just here to set things right. Now, this is where we get to the purpose of why I'm telling you all of this. I indicated before that the folks from my village like to keep these things private, and for the most part, I agree. I'm not a fan of airing our business to the outside world. It's attention we don't need. Unfortunately, I don't think we have a choice this time. It began a few of weeks ago during one of my shifts at the booth. Everything was going nicely for the most part. No fresh dead passed through that night, nor did any living try. The only customer I had was our regular poor old bee, puzzled as ever. After him, things was silent for a few hours, until I heard a steady clop going down the road. Yet again, these days I'm not terrified anymore. I've seen the hunter and his moose enough times that I don't frightened either of them. Like I stated, I've come to admire them for the things they take out of this world. The one thing I often fear is the sight of whatever it is they're pulling out. That night was no exception. They reached the gate and halted in front of it. Before I went to raise the barrier arm, I aimed my torch onto the rope being pulled behind and the awful item tied at the end of it. The rope was wound in a knot around an enormous pair of cloven hooves that belonged to what appeared like the lower half of some species of deer. As I progressed up the body with my headlamp, I quickly noticed that this wasn't just some enormous buck. The legs may have been suggestive of one, but the upper body was that of a man. A man in a striped red and blue clown suit. The sleeves were shredded at the wrist, and protruding from them were long, blackened hands with claws for fingers. The head was by far the most horrific element. Its nose and lips, like the rest of its head, were covered in skin like that of a pale man, yet their shape was that of a deer. Blood spilled out of its half-opened mouth. The ears were similar, with the same pale color and feel as a man's, but shaped like a deer's. It was like someone grabbed human ears and stretched them out, altering them to match the hideous shape they sought. On top sat a red and blue jester hat with a set of antlers springing out over them. I froze for a second at seeing the entirety of this beast, but snapped out of it when I reminded myself that I had a task to perform, and that I better do it if I didn't want to see this monstrosity any longer. I moved over to the barrier arm and raised it. The moose began its trot forward along the road and past the gate. As they passed me, I couldn't help but watch the deer clown monster it was dragging behind. A streak of blood followed on the road behind it right before it passed past the booth fully. I lit up its face with my flashlight to have a final look. Its eyelids shot open, showing the black and brown eyes underneath. Then it opened its mouth and let out a loud, pain-filled bleat as it stooped down and clawed at the knot, holding its hooves in. In only a few seconds, the ropes were cut and the beast attempted to stand. It didn't get far in its initial try, however, since the bull moose in front of it whacked its head with a strong kick. Another splash of blood poured from the clown's lips, along with one of its teeth, as it fell back to the ground, obviously knocked out for a minute. While it recovered, the hunter turned his moose around to face it head-on. I rushed from the booth and hid behind a tree on the side of the road, but I kept an eye on the fight. Air blasted from the moose's nostrils as it began to grunt. His grunts were louder and deeper than the bleats of the deer clown. I could feel my chest rattle with each forceful groan. The clown finally stood and gazed back at the hunter and moose, letting out a few more bleats as if to confront them. At its standing height, this monster was taller than the moose, Yet it was evident the moose was considerably larger and heavier overall. The moose dropped its head and charged. Before it collided, the clown attempted to claw at the hunter on its back, but failed. It was hoisted up off the ground by the moose's antlers and driven through a row of trees that came crashing down on top of it. The moose backed up a step and turned, allowing the hunter to throw a new rope around the clown's head. The moose charged away with the hunter holding the fresh rope, and they began to drag the clown by the neck. I imagined they were expecting to finally make it around the curve this time. Unfortunately, the clown was still conscious and sliced the rope with its claws. Again, the clown didn't waste any time, hurrying to its hooves and dashing into the woods. The hunter on his moose followed, and in only a moment they were both out of sight. I only realized my hard breathing once all was silent again. It took me an hour to muster up the nerve to leave the tree line and return to my booth. When I did, I noticed the tooth from the clown laying on the road and collected it. Fortunately for me, the rest of my shift was uneventful. Unfortunately, the hunter never returned with the clown. When the sheriff picked me up at sunrise, I told him to hurry to the town hall for an emergency meeting. During the way, I contacted everyone else and told them to be there as soon as possible. At the conference, I presented the tooth and gave an account of what I had just witnessed. There was a combination of emotions. None of the other attendants had ever seen something escape from the hunter before, and none knew what it signified. The agreed-upon action was to wait at least a week. It's unusual to not see the hunter and his moose for more than a week, so we figured he would catch the clown in the following few of days, and all would be sorted. I sincerely wish that was what happened. A day later, a video leaked on the internet from the town across. It showed a pair of deer antlers peeking up above the tops of trees as the man recording was driving. A few days after that, another video emerged. This one was recorded by a woman who awoke in the middle of the night to laughter outdoors. Halfway through the video, you can see the antlers and part of the cap outside of a second-story window. The woman recording didn't notice, but commenters on the video clearly did. Last week, someone halfway across the state shared a hazy photo of a black moose on a hill in a clearing between the trees, far off in the distance. These are only the ones I've seen. Now you can see why we've been having meetings every week. I can tell we're not the only ones in a panic either. Strangers started turning up around town, not the kind who are just passing through. They try their hardest to fit in, but they stick out like a sore thumb. The dead giveaway is when they walk up to local taverns and cafes, striking up a conversation before asking individuals what they've seen around here lately, asking about the booth and the weird road. In the last week or two, they've stopped trying so hard to disguise it. Black government SUVs have been overwhelming the parking places downtown. We kept the tooth in the town hall, along with every other document and record we have about the booth, and now it's all disappeared. It's evident that whatever happened that night wasn't intended to, and we weren't the only ones who noticed. I didn't work yesterday night, but the attendant who did had a lot to tell this morning in our meeting. The feds drove out to the booth and took a look around. He begged with them not to drive through, but in response, they told him they already knew why they shouldn't, something we weren't expecting. It's just a matter of time before they come for me, I suppose. I'll tell them the truth when the time comes. As much as we like to keep it a secret in our town, the genie is out of the bottle. I decided I would at least tell all of you before the feds arrive. Every one of you should know what's out there. As for me, I'll keep watching the booth at night. Sticking to my tasks is about all I can do. Still, I'll be keeping up with all of the developments that I can. I can only surmise based on the posts I've linked together, but it appears like the clown is still on the move, and our hunter is close following. I can only pray that he catches it quickly. In the meanwhile, if you hear weird laughter in your backyard at night, stay inside.